This is Sarah Coleman Ferrell. Mrs. Ferrell was born in 1817 and lived to be till 1903. She started her garden in 1841 and spent the entire life of 87 years working on her garden and her masterpiece. This spot is where Sarah Coleman Ferrell started her garden. The well was then covered with a frame summer house, and the ironwork has been added since. From the well, she planted 4 corners with cedars. In between the cedars were tree boxwood, and then she began making the paths and the beds from those first starting points. Here we're walking under giant magnolia trees that were planted from seed by Mrs. Ferrell. They are written up in the archives in Montgomery, Alabama, in a story about Ferrell Gardens when it was then called the Terraces in 1887, and describes this magnolia walk in the Ferrell Gardens. Here is a giant ginkgo tree, also planted by Mrs. Ferrell, the largest one that I've ever seen. This is a bunch of grapes that Mrs. Ferrell planted to represent the bunch of grapes that the Israelite scouts brought out of the Promised Land. It was so large they bore it upon a staff between their shoulders. And Mrs. Ferrell, I am sure, was reading her Bible and came across this, and it gave her her inspiration for planting this oversized bunch of grapes. Mrs. Ferrell's family, her mother and father were Mr. and Mrs. Mickleberry Ferrell, and Mrs. Ferrell lived next door to them in LaGrange on the land that they gave her when she married. She started her garden on that 80 acres of property which had before been a cotton field. It was all terraced for cotton, and she started the garden with the same terraces and built stone walls with stone quarried on the land that the Ferrells owned, and they were the largest landowners in Troup County at that time. When she was quite young, well, actually, when she first built this house and started living on this spot, she had tuberculosis, and the doctor was called and or diagnosed it actually as tuberculosis, and Sarah said, if you'll stay out in the open all that you can, said it might prolong your life a few years. She was in her 20s when he told her this, and she lived to be 87. So I think that was good medicine for her and for me, and it is for many people. Gardening is a tonic. This is the church garden that Mrs. Ferrell planted, and she planted in boxwood a harp, an organ, 2 mourners' benches, and a collection plate. In the collection plate, she planted marigolds for the collection and other colorful flowers in the flower beds. After I moved here, I changed the theme to a white garden because I thought that a church garden would be more sacred and more restful with white, all white. This is the 6th terrace in the garden, and the lowest one. It commands a beautiful view of the house, and also of this beautiful dry stone wall, which was built with slave labor, and stone started falling out of it several years ago. And I had a stonemason come from Columbus to repair it. And when he took the stones out and numbered each one and laid them out in the bed so that he could put them back in order, he found that back of this wall is a handmade clay brick retaining wall, which was also built with slave labor and is a beautiful example of the craftsmanship of the slaves of that time. Mrs. Ferrell's design is still here. She planted the boxwood for the paths. She designed the beds, and has been told me that the way she did it, she would just take a stick and she would draw in the ground the design that she wanted. As far as I know, she never had a professional come in to do the work. She designed it herself, and with the help of the slave labor, planted it and maintained it. And so really, this is her design. The garden is today. The transition to the garden after Mrs. Ferrell died took some time, because the heirs, I presume, there was some question, you know, about settling the estate and all. And they didn't know what they would do with it, nor how they would share it. So finally, it was sold to Mr. Fuller Callaway, Sr. During Mrs. Ferrell's lifetime, he would come out and visit with her on Sunday afternoons. They were quite prominent in town, and I'm sure Dr. and Ms. Callaway knew the Ferrells as well as everybody else. And at that time, of course, people were allowed just to wander through the park, as it was called. And so he came out on Sunday afternoons and would sit with Ms. Ferrell and enjoy talking with her, and she enjoyed him very much. And during these visits, she told him several times, Fuller said, I hope when I die that you will buy this place, because says you love it like I do, and says you will take care of it. Said my children don't care anything about it, and they won't be willing to work and look after it, and said please you buy it. Well, he said, Miss Ferrell said, I would like to, but says, you know, I'm just saving money for my business, but if I can, I certainly will do that for you. So really, he was surprised by the time she died that he was able to buy it from her heirs, but several years after her death. The place had grown up considerably with weeds. And I was told by one of the black men who worked here that his first job was to clear the paths and find where the boxwood was. The Callaway seniors changed the garden through the direction of Neil Reed only by adding statuary and fountains and benches, stone benches, because Neil Reed, the architect, felt that the garden had a definite Italian influence created by Mrs. Ferrell. And so he embodied that in the house and then in the furnishings in the garden. So they were added after 1916. Mrs. Callaway had no experience with gardening before she moved here, but she took to it very quickly and loved the garden and took beautiful care of it, and everyone loved her, the flowers and the people that worked for her. On this terrace, when this house was built by Mr. Fuller Callaway Sr., the architect for the house added all of these stone benches because he felt that the garden had a definite Italian influence. And the vistas, the evergreen vistas and the stone benches are part of that Italian influence. The azaleas on this terrace are beautiful when they're in bloom in the spring. And at the beginning are rose-red ones, Hannah DeGeary, and beyond they're pink, and they are coral bells. This is Lover's Lane, and there's a very sweet story about Mr. Fuller Callaway Sr. on this lane. When he was alive, he was in the garden one Sunday afternoon, quietly meditating in one of the sequestered corners, when two old gentlemen were walking through. And one of them said, well, what'd you think of it since Mr. Callaway bought it? And the second one says, well, it don't look no different to me. And the first one said, well, it's funny to me, all them statues he put of himself, and said not a damn one of them looks like him. And the men had thought that Socrates and Plato at the other end were supposed to be Mr. Callaway. I got into the family by marrying Fuller Callaway. My sister, Virginia, had married Cason Callaway, and so I had known Fuller since I was 6. And we were both in Cason and Virginia's wedding. So during the summers, I would come up to visit them and would see Fuller. And over the years, of course, fell madly in love with him, but he didn't know I was alive. I was so little to him. And then we were married in 1930, which was 10 years after Virginia and Casey married. So you can figure that out, how old I was when I married. But by marrying Fuller, after his mother died, Casey and Fuller had an agreement that everything would be divided in half of her estate. So the question of the house came up, and they decided that the fairest way to do the house was to each put in a bid for it, and the highest bid would get the house, see, for their estate. So Fuller stayed awake for nights thinking about how much he would bid. He didn't want to bid too much, you see. But finally he decided on an amount. And then when the bids were opened, I think he was just shaking. And really, I mean, I was frightened that we might get it, you know. So when he opened the bids, Fuller's bid was very slightly above Casey's. And he got the house, so that was taken out of their estate, you see, and Casey got property to recompense for the value of the house. And so we moved up here. I was frightened beyond words because I didn't know what I'd do with this big house, and the little house that I had over on Vernon was just what I'd always dreamed of, just a little cottage with a picket fence and little bay windows, and I loved it dearly. And this was just overwhelming to me. And then, of course, I had the 2 children by then. Ida was a year old when we moved up here. And I had the children to think about, you know, and there was a lot to be done seeing about the house and the garden, and I didn't like that time being robbed from them. But anyway, I made out. I survived it, and I guess everything turned out all right. This old well has been here since Mrs. Ferrell's time, and the well had a wooden frame summer house over it during Mrs. Ferrell's lifetime. But when Mr. Callaway changed the place after this house was built, the present house was built, this iron wellhead was added. The well has been covered because of the danger of children playing in the garden. The boxwood garden behind me was originally a maze, and the story has been told that my husband's Uncle Pope Callaway, who lived in this house with the family, was lost in the maze one time and didn't like it one bit and called one of the gardeners to come and plow him out. So that ended the maze, and this garden was planted after the house was built in 1960. This is the original entrance to the old garden, and in this spot was an iron gate, very plain. So a few years ago, I learned about Ivan Bailey when I was on a visit to Savannah and saw his beautiful ironwork of gates and fences. And I inquired who had made them and was told it was Ivan Bailey. So I asked for his address and telephone number, and they said, well, he's moved to Atlanta. So I immediately, when I returned home, called a friend in Atlanta to find out if they knew about him, and they did not, but they would find out. So they got his address for me and his telephone number, and I called him and asked him if he'd come down in consultation that I had a project for an iron gate. Well, he was delighted and came down. And we looked at this spot, and he designed this gate to go here, and it's one of my favorite pieces in the garden. I love what he did with it. Then to the left, there is a planting in the garden. This is the entrance to the garden as Miss Ferrell planted it. And right at the entrance of her garden, she planted in capital letters, G-O-D. In the beginning of the Bible, it reads, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. And in the beginning of her garden, she gave glory to him for its creation. I go out every morning at 8 to the greenhouse. That is the hour that the help come, and say good morning to everybody and then give them their assignment for the day. It seems foolish that I can't just plan a week's work and stop there, but you can't with gardening because you don't know what tomorrow's weather will bring, you don't know whether everybody's coming in the next day, and you don't know what may have befallen the garden during the night with storms and debris and animals, all the vicissitudes of gardening. Well, each season, of course, has its plan, and I handle that by having monthly calendars. And then I put, for instance, now if I think of something that needs to be done in the fall, I put that on my fall calendar. Then I do the same with the other months. Constant things are things like pruning, which is most important on a place like this with all of the trees and the shrubbery and all, and has to be done correctly. So with the help of Mr. Donald Muller, who's been with me 15 years, we do all of the pruning together. And then you have the planting of change of season plantings. For instance, pansies are planted in November, and they take care of the winter months. And then when the weather becomes warm, the pansies are taken out, and either marigolds, petunias, or some annual is put in their place for color, summer color. My favorite times of the year are the spring and the fall. Well, the spring, of course, all the beautiful blossoming and things coming to life again after the winter. And then the fall, because of the colors and the cool air and the shadows, are beautiful, you know, especially beautiful in the fall.
I moved to this house when I was about a year old, and so I've grown up knowing nothing but these gardens. And they've always been special to me, and I've always enjoyed being in them and seeing all the beautiful flowers and trees and birds and insects. I really enjoy the insects, they're interesting. But it's just a marvelous place to be. All the memories were just enjoying being in them because they were so beautiful. And I know a long time ago there were hedges of camellias all around, which are gone now because our climate's harsher. And a lot of them have been lost, but there were just rows and rows of camellias. And when they would bloom, all those beautiful petals would fall on the ground. Well, as children, we would get in those and play like they were costumes and cover ourselves up in the petals. And it's just always been a wonderful spot to be and a fun spot.
This stone bench was added to the garden in 1916 when the present house was built. It is a very favorite spot of mine because of a happy evening I spent here in 1928 with Fuller Callaway Jr. when I came for a dance that was held in LaGrange and stayed with him and his mother here at the house. After the dance, the orchestra, Weedy Mauer, who was a very popular band leader at that time, came out with his band and played for a group of Fuller friends in the garden, in the moonlight. It was a very romantic evening. This is the herb garden. The herb garden is planted with culinary, medicinal, and aromatic herbs. Among them are comfrey, lamb's ears, rosemary, thyme, chives, basil, and many salvias. This bed is planted in carnation gold yarrow, and it has been greatly successful, has been here for a number of years, and has had very little attention, just a division occasionally here and there when I lose one. I've learned three things. I've learned patience, perseverance, and acceptance. I've learned patience to wait for the plants to grow in their own time and their own way. I've learned perseverance to try again and to keep trying when something fails that you want to grow and don't the first time. Try again because you will succeed eventually. I've learned acceptance because the weather is one of the great deterrents to gardening. There is nothing you can do about it. You can't help rain, you can't help drought, so accept it and don't talk about it and complain about it. In looking back over my years of being in this beautiful garden, I look out and I see all the beauty around me, and it makes me wonder how I deserved all this beauty. It's been a joy to me, it's been a joy to my family, and it's been a joy to many friends and strangers as well. And the exercise that I've had has been good for my health, The interest I've had has pulled me through some tough times and given me hope for the future, and I love it, really.